Hello, Honors 201. It's me again. I hope everybody's well, uh, continuing to stay safe, enjoying the nice weather when there's nice weather. Um, Hope everybody's good. This video is going to be about the New Testament. This is going to be the last official video that I'm going to make you. Maybe I'll end up making another video. But for right now, this is it. Um, Obviously, this video is over the New Testament, the stuff that we read from the New Testament from our book. Let's talk about that. So, for one thing, I want to say before we even begin, I guess I want to say two things. One, just like when we read the Old Testament, I want us to think about the New Testament as a text like other texts in our book. I know again that many of us have grown up as the Bible as a very special book. But for the time being, we're going to try to look at it the way we look at the other text in our class, which again is hard to do, but we're going to give it a shot. Um, the other thing that I want to mention is that hopefully I can keep this video short. There's a lot to talk about, and I'll do the best I can, okay, people? Because of the subject matter, because it's the New Testament, and because it's so touchy subject matter for lots of people. I might go a little longer than 10 or 15 minutes. So let's see here. Okay, so first thing, since we are reading the New Testament, people are very familiar with the New Testament. I want to point out a few things about the New Testament before we speak specifically about the stuff that we read. One, this is very important. We've got four Gospels, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We know that Mark was the first gospel written, probably written some 40, 60 years after Jesus' death. John, on the other hand, was the last gospel written. It was probably written 100, 120 years after Jesus' death. Matthew and Luke, somewhere in between those two numbers. Um, and so we know, and again, there's a lot of biblical scholarship out there. So there's a lot of stuff that you can learn about the Bible if you really want to. For instance, again, Mark is the first gospel. Luke and Matthew are both based on Mark. They are both Mark with some changes, okay? John is sort of completely separate. Again, it came much later, and so is not quite the same. One of the things that people talk about when they talk about the Gospels is they talk about the fact that they differ. One says one thing, another mentions another thing. They're not entirely consistent. And the way that's usually explained is something along the lines of, oh, well, these eyewitnesses accounts, of course, not everyone remembers the same thing perfectly. And so that, we have these discrepancies in the Gospels because of that. That is probably not correct. We need to start thinking of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written for very different audiences, and the things in them that differ for reasons. Now, another thing to go along with that is it's worth noting, right, that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We don't know who Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John even are. We can assume that those names are names, disciples, but they were not written by disciples. They were not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You might say that the let's say Matthew is a book that talks about the stuff that people who might have been Mathonians Matthewonians. So Luke, for instance, represents sort of a group of people and their beliefs about Jesus. Mark sort of represents a group of people and their beliefs about Jesus. Again, they are purposely different from each other. They are not accidentally different from each other. Again, they have different audiences, and we're not going to get into all of that. But want to point out again, not written by disciples, not written by eyewitnesses, written much later. I suppose, from my perspective, if we're looking at Mark being written 40 to 60 years ago, let's call that 50 years. That's like me writing about something that happened 2 or 3 years before I was born, etc. So the point is that they are anonymously written. We do not know who the authors are. We know that they are not people that eyewitness to Jesus, though. We are absolutely sure of that. So, again, a lot of information out there about the Bible. Again, most of us grew up in some sort of Christian family. If you consider yourself a Christian, if you think of the Bible as being your important book, do some of that research on the Bible. For being such an important book, few people know very much about the Bible. At any rate, another thing that I want to point out is how the stories of Jesus, we tend to sort of smash them all together. So, for instance, when we talked about the Old Testament, we talked about the fact that people take some parts of the first creation story and marry that with other parts of the other creation story, and we end up with a story that is sort of a mishmash of two stories put together. That is sort of what happens with the Gospels. That certainly is what's going on in our book, because in our book, they detail things, they go through it chronologically, but they use different sources, right? So it starts out with Luke, and then we move to another passage from Luke, but then a passage from Matthew, Luke. So it's slamming together two books. And I just want to point out that is not an accurate way of looking at things. That is not accurate to either version. It is a conglomeration of the two versions and thus not accurate to either of the original versions. Having said that, we're going to put that aside and talk about some other stuff. Okay. Oh my God, people. There's so much to talk about, and I'm afraid that this is going to take just a little bit, people. We're going to try. Okay, so first of all, let's just sort of go through what we have in our book. We begin with the birth and the youth of Jesus. Things worth pointing out here. For instance, in the story that in the version that we read from Luke. Want you to notice that there are no three wise men in Luke. There is no star guiding people in Luke. There is no mention of the virgin birth in Luke. Which I think is interesting to think about. Some people say, oh, well, again, maybe one person remembers this and another person remembers this, and this is why they are different. Well, I don't know about you, but if there was a virgin birth, I think people would remember that. And so the fact that there's no mention of that in Luke is sort of curious, right? Again, we end up slamming these stories together. What else do we learn? We get Jesus's birth. We get a glimpse of him at 12 years old. And then the next thing we see is when he's doing his work, his missionary work, right, in his 30s. So we have a huge gap in time. So why so little of his youth? I don't have a good answer for that, but it's something I'd like you to think about. Why do we see so little of Jesus's youth? And I'm not sure why. Okay, let's get to Jesus' teaching, which is, of course, in our society, the thing that people are sort of most interested in when it comes to the Bible. In the Bible, frequently, Jesus' words are put in red letters to emphasize how important we believe Jesus' words are. So let's look at Jesus' words. Most famously, the Sermon on the Mount. And let's talk about what he says in the Sermon on the Mount. Now, what I want to point out to begin with is that the stuff that Jesus was teaching was super radical. His ideas are absolutely wild. They're totally wild. And, well, so for instance, okay, so these are the things that he teaches. If you commit adultery, it's as bad as thinking about adultery. If you think about murder, that's as bad as actually committing murder. The thought is as bad as the thing. This is a really crazy idea, if you ask me, right? I think there's an enormous difference between thinking about murdering someone and actually murdering them. But Jesus says, no, there's not a difference. You can be judged just for thinking it in the same way that you can be judged for actually doing it. Again, this seems like to me to be a very radical idea. Thinking something is as bad as doing it. This is something that has carried over in the church for years and years and years, and this is why, in lots of ways, church people oftentimes don't want to think about or watch bad movies or curse words or sex or whatever it is that they have a problem with. They don't want to be seeing that because just thinking about it is a type of sin, right? Just thinking about it, so they try to avoid it completely. Okay, so this is a radical idea. Murder is murder if you think about it, if you do it. It's the same thing. Radical idea number one from Jesus. One, I want to point out that it seems like to me, very few people believe. I don't know about you, but again, I don't believe it. To me, it doesn't seem right. Okay, but that's his teaching. Two, don't defend yourself. Now, turn the other cheek. If somebody hits you, you let them hit you on the other side. Now, of course, people may say, "Oh no, there were reasons for this. This is doesn't mean that you're not supposed to defend yourself. It just means something else." I just want to say that I believe that when he says don't defend yourself, he means it. And the reason why I'm sure he means it is because that's what he does. Okay? So when he says don't defend yourself, I mean, if we're watching, when people say, what would Jesus do? Well, if we look at what Jesus did, he did not defend himself and he let them beat him to death and hang him on a cross. Even though he didn't have to do that, he did that. I'd like to point out that to some degree, like Socrates, right, who doesn't offer a real defense. Okay, so don't defend yourself. Again, I don't know about you, but this seems like a radical idea. I don't know anybody whose parents actually taught them that. I know my parents, growing up in a very Christian family, they taught me that, hey, if somebody's punching me, I need to punch back, right? Not just let them beat me up. And again, I don't know anybody who was taught that, oh no, just let people beat you up. But that's what Jesus says, okay? He also says, love your enemy. This is not quote unquote natural. This is not something that we normally do. Again, this is a very radical idea. Another really radical idea, give when people ask and give more than they ask for. So if somebody asks for a blanket, you give them 2 blankets. If somebody asks for $10, you give them $20. If somebody asks, you give. Again, I don't know if this is what people do. I mean, sometimes, right, when you see a homeless person, do you give them money? If somebody's asking you for something, do you give it to them? Do you give them more than what they ask for? Sometimes, sometimes not. But Jesus says we need to do that all the time with everyone. Okay. Another relatively radical idea, don't pray in public. When you think about our society, this is a radical idea. We put prayers in front of everything, prayers in front of Congress, prayers in front of, well, people used to, right, have prayers in front of graduations and blah, blah, blah. Lots of open public praying. Jesus says, no, no public praying. Go into a closet and pray. And again, I'm going to say he really means that, because if we look at his example, that's what he did. He prayed in private. Um, the biggest one, maybe one of the biggest radical teachings of his, is no money. Um, get rid of your money. He says, right? You can either love God or you can love money. But if you love God, you will hate money. And if you love money, you will hate God. You cannot do both of them. He says repeatedly, get rid of your money. A rich man comes to him and says, hey, what can I do to get into the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus says, well, you can take all your stuff and give it away and follow me. And of course, in the Bible, the guy was sort of upset about that, right? He was like, oh, bummer. Because we don't want to give all our stuff away. And now, some people are going to say, oh, no, Jesus doesn't mean no money. We can't have no money at all. He just means the love of money. Okay, but I just want to point out that's not what Jesus says. Jesus says no money. And likewise, when somebody says, when he says turn the other cheek, he meant something else. Well, that's what he said, right? And so, no money. I don't know anybody in our society who thinks that having no money is a good idea. Again, that would make you homeless. Again, I'm going to say Jesus is literal about this, though, because he didn't keep any money. So I think all of these things, though, and terribly radical, I think that he means these things literally. And the reason why I think he means them literally is because they are possible things to do, and he did them. He didn't have any money. He loved his enemy. He didn't defend himself. I think that this is literal, people. How do we square that in our society with all of the money that we are all sort of obsessed with, and yet Jesus makes it very clear that money is bad? I don't know how we deal with that in our society. And then one more really radical idea that he has is do not think about the future. Do not plan for tomorrow. Don't worry about where your next meal is coming from. God will provide for you. Don't plan for the future. Again, I just want to say, who does this? Nobody does this. I got money saved for my kids' college. Me and my wife put money away to plan for the future. We go to work and we put money in the bank so that we can go to the store and get food, so that we know that on Tuesday we're going to have food, and on Wednesday we're going to have food, and on Thursday we don't just leave the refrigerator empty and say, God will provide for us for today. No, we make plans. Well, he says, don't do that. Don't worry about tomorrow. Don't worry about the future. Now, okay, so all of these things are very radical ideas. These are very radical ideas. And again, I say they're super radical because, one, I don't know anyone who teaches them other than Jesus. Most of our, again, Christian people that we know who follow Jesus don't even do these things because, again, they're totally radical. Um, Okay. I think this is interesting to think about. We in our society are very interested in, again, quote unquote, what would Jesus do? Well, we know what Jesus would do. And what Jesus would do is very different from what the vast majority of people in our society who follow him do. Jesus was homeless. Jesus walked around. Jesus didn't plan for the future. Jesus didn't have any money. Jesus didn't do all of this stuff that we do as a society, a whole bunch. So I just think it's interesting. Why is it that we have a religion that has a leader who teaches stuff that is so radical that most of us can't even begin to follow it? And yet that is the standard that we have set with the religion. I don't know, people. It's an interesting thing to think about. Um, Another thing that I want to touch on, again, sorry this video is going a little long, people. I'll do the best I can. The other thing I wanted to touch on was teaching in parables. Jesus talks about teaching in parables. Why teach in parables? I know that lots of people say, well, you teach in parables because what it gives people a story to help get the lesson. Instead of just telling them the lesson, it gives them a story that they can think about, which is a fair enough idea, except for the fact that when you can't figure out the story, when you have the story. So why teach in parables? I don't know about you, but I would prefer to just know what I'm supposed to do. Like y'all, if I were to teach in parables, if I were to teach in parables, you came to me and you said, hey Pete, when's that next paper due? And I was like, there was a man once by a river and he was fishing and blah blah blah. You don't want that from me. You don't want a parable. You want me to tell you the due date. And that's what I want too. I don't want a parable about how do I get to heaven. I want him to tell me what do I have to do. Now, again, you can ask, you can come up with good reasons for why a person would teach in parables. But I also want to say, I can come up with good reasons why teaching in parables sounds like a horrible idea. But that's the way that it goes in the Bible. So the question is, why? Why teach in parables? Why is he represented as teaching in parables? Okay, I would like to couple of other things very quickly. One, I want you to again sort of notice here. Well, let's see. Jesus's big crime here is claiming that he is God, is claiming to be a descendant of God, and that's ultimately what gets him killed. People think, oh, this is such blasphemy to uh, 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 claim your God. We're going to kill you just for claiming your God. I just want to point out now how different that is. I mean, people go around claiming to be spiritually gifted in all sorts of ways. A lot of crazy people go around saying that they're God or Jesus. It's this really common delusion. And I just want to say we don't kill all those people anymore. Why did we kill them in the past? Well, I don't know. Okay, so then we go into the story of the resurrection, and so here's going to be my big question for y'all, right? My big question is going to be this: Jesus's teachings, though very radical, are possible. They're possible to do to some degree or another, right? They're possible, and we know that they're possible because Jesus did it. And so, since they're possible and Jesus did it, and this is what he taught, I'm going to say that he means that stuff literally. He means literally don't have money. Now, when we get to the resurrection, um, obviously the resurrection, to me, can't be literal in the sense that it can't actually happen in real life. So, okay, so we know that people don't rise from the dead. So if we're told that somebody rose from the dead, we can assume that that's some sort of symbol or some sort of idea. Now, of course, I know a lot of people are going to say, "Oh no, Jesus really did rise from the dead." But this gets me to my big question, which is, how do we tell the difference between literal language and metaphorical language when we're reading the New Testament? How do we know when we're supposed to read something literally and read something metaphorically? Again, the stuff that is literal, his teachings, what he did, all of that stuff, people oftentimes try to explain that stuff away as, again, oh, he didn't really mean no money. He didn't really mean don't plan for tomorrow. He didn't really mean that thinking stuff is as bad as doing it, even though those are his exact words and that's what he did. And people say, ah, no, he can't be literal about all that stuff. Meanwhile, when we get to the resurrection, which is something that is very, very unlikely, in the sense that, again, we don't know anybody else who's come back from death. It seems like to me, because that's impossible, that the resurrection must be metaphorical, that it can't be literal. In the same way that Gilgamesh didn't literally run into scorpion people, he metaphorically ran into scorpion people. And the reason why we know it was metaphorical is because we know scorpion people don't exist, and therefore it must be a metaphor for something. So the thing that I find interesting is that, and this is just my past experience with students, is they tend to believe that Jesus's teachings were metaphorical, but they tend to believe that the resurrection was literal. And to me, that seems kind of opposite in the sense that, again, resurrection not possible, other stuff possible. Resurrection clearly must be a metaphor. Now, again, someone's going to say, well, no, he really did rise from the dead. Okay, and if that's what happened, that's true. But I just want to point out, in history, we can't know what happened in the past. We can't know. All we can do is guess. And if we're guessing about the past, we will never guess that a miracle took place, because miracles are not, they're out of the realm of what is most likely. So all we can say about the past is what is most likely. Miracles are never most likely. Now, they might have happened, we'll never know. But since we can only know what is most likely to have happened, we can never count on miracles being there, because miracles are the most unlikely thing in the entire world. So, my point, when do we know that we're reading something that is literal? When do we know that it's metaphorical? I'm going to say that we know that it's metaphorical when it's physically impossible, and that we know that it's literal when it is literally possible. I could be wrong about all that. But this is the thing that I find interesting, right? And obviously, we know this. Many people read the Old Testament, the creation story, as a literal story. Some people read that as a metaphorical story, etc. How do you know when you're reading which way to go? How do you know when it's literal? How do you know when it's metaphorical? It seems like to me that stuff that is literal can also be metaphorical, but stuff that is metaphorical cannot be literal. Huh. So y'all tell me. Sorry this video goes on for so long. Looking forward to your comments in the comment box. And again, I hope everybody is well. And I will talk to you later. Oh, well, I won't be making the video later. Oh my God, so this might be the last time I talk to you. But I'll be sending you emails and I'll be in touch. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.